Hey, it's A Humble Collector here. In today's video, we're going to take a look at the 2-panel death card of Fritz Auinger. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and get started. So going from the top here, we have an Iron Cross, and then moving down. Reminder of our deeply beloved son, the motorcyclist Fritz Auinger, from the Koppelmargut in Grünberg, parish of Sierning, which is in Austria, who fell for the fatherland in May of 1942 in the fight against Russia in the 21st year of his life. Now, unfortunately, something that we do occasionally see on death cards, I don't have an exact date here. However, I found a guy who lines up pretty well with everything that we do know. I did find a casualty record for a Fritz or Friedrich, who was born on April 17th, 1922 in Sierning, and was a Schutze in the 3rd Company of Kradschutzen Battalion 23, which was part of the 23rd Panzer Division, a Kradschutzen Battalion being a motorcycle battalion. As we can see there, being Kradschutzen being a motorcyclist. And he was actually killed on May 26th, 1942. And interestingly, I do have a unit history for the 23rd. This one being kind of unique in the fact that it's actually in English. Those of you who have been watching my channel for a while know that the bulk of my research material is actually written in German. But we have the combat history of the 23rd Panzer Division in World War II by Dr. Ernst Rebentisch. It's a pretty good book in the sense that, what's the word I'm looking for? It's very dense. It is definitely not like a popular history book that your average person could pick up and read. It is very much meant to be a blow-by-blow, heavily detailed account of what the unit was doing, which I really appreciate. That being said, I would not sit down and read this book cover to cover, but for research like this, it is absolutely perfect. So if you have any interest in the 23rd Panzer Division, this is a book that should be in your library. Now, from the book, we know that at the time of Fritz's death, the 23rd Panzer Division was involved in the Battle of Kharkiv. Now, the battle's wrapping up at this point. It'll be over by the end of the month. And the situation, from everything I've read, seems to be pure and utter chaos. You have the Soviets who at this point know the battle's over. There are pockets of Soviet resistance, but there's also thousands of men that are trying to surrender or trying to escape back to Soviet lines. And things just seem to be very hectic all over the place. As evidenced by the map here, which covers the period when Fritz was killed, if I zoom out here. But yeah, you can actually see, per his casualty record, he was killed at, right, so as we can see here, there's the village of Losovenka, which lines up pretty well with the casualty record, and we can actually see on this other map here, the 23rd Panzer Division's assault on that town. Now, the casualty record I have itself references that Fritz was killed at Hill 1.8 west of Losovenka. I don't think that's Hill 1.8. I think it's a hill 1.8 kilometers west, because there are several hills mentioned here, but none of them are Hill 1.8. And I could spend probably a couple hours reading through everything the 23rd Panzer Division did during the battle, but I'm just going to start with May 26th, since that was the day that Fritz was killed. And you'll see that the Kradschutzen Battalion actually comes up a few times. During the early morning hours of 26th May, mass Soviet infantry forces sought to take advantage of the darkness and break through in the sector of Kampfgruppe Soltman. The attack collapsed in the face of concentrated tank fire. 4 Russian tanks were destroyed. From Hill 175.3, the 3rd Company of Panzer Pioneer Battalion 51, the 1st Company of Panzerjäger Abteilung 128, and 2 8.8 centimeter flak blocked the retreat route of the Soviets from Mikhailovka to Krutogorka. The Kampfgruppe moved out at 0800 hours, entered Mikhailovka, and took the village. 2,500 prisoners were taken, several guns, including 2 German heavy field howitzers, 3 tanks, and a large quantity of equipment were captured. The Russian forces showed increasing signs of uncertainty. After their march columns were battered and scattered, they usually pulled back to the west, northwest, and south, where they once again ran into the concentric fires of the attacking German divisions. German infantry arrived at Mikhailovka from the west and assumed responsibility for the village. At the same time that the armored Kampfgruppe had moved out, Kampfgruppe Bachmann continued its attack on Lipki. Enemy resistance collapsed, the village was taken, and a rapid advance to the southwest, the Kisilish River and the northern edge of Mikhailovka were reached around 1000 hours. An urgent order from Korpsgruppe Breif was received at 0940 hours. Strong enemy forces threatened to break through the sector of the 16th Panzer Division at Losovenka and to the south. Shift everything toward Losovenka and advance from there into the Losovenka River Fork. That meant that the Kampfgruppe of the division had to turn 180 degrees. Kampfgruppe Soltman moved out expeditiously to advance on Losovenka through Krutogorka. The motorcycle battalion, freed up from its mission at the Petropavlovsky estate, was sent through Chopenka in the direction of Hill 186.0 to the north of Losovenka. It was closely followed by the 6th Battalion of Schutze Regiment 126 and the division's anti-tank battalion. An armored reconnaissance patrol reported from south of Hill 186, masses of Russians in front of me. At 1105 hours, the 1st Battalion of Panzer Regiment 201 entered Krutayarka. In spite of the heavy and well-directed fire by Soviet artillery, as well as the constant anti-tank rifle fire on the German armored vehicles, the majority of the enemy forces was becoming increasingly leaderless. The earth-bound masses of Russian infantry approached the German tanks in densely packed groups in order to surrender. Mercilessly, the Soviet artillery fired amongst them and cut broad swaths through the ranks of their soldiers, who had no weapons and were only thinking of their own salvation by being taken prisoner. The barren meadows and farmlands were covered in the dead, and whimpering Red Army soldiers crawling forward, and weapons and equipment. Somewhat offset from the masses were numerous dead officers and commissars who had committed suicide. In the middle of this chaos were the division's tanks and armored personnel carriers. Russian doctors, male and female, worked ceaselessly at a clearing station in Krutayarka. The high ground outside of Losovenka was reached on a broad front. The motorcycle battalion, positioned on Hill 186, screamed. The stream of surrendering Soviets continued unabated. Suddenly, however, 3 T-34s showed up amongst them, supported by Soviet artillery and anti-tank guns. Reacting quickly, the 2nd Battalion of Panzer Regiment 201 knocked out one of the T-34s, whereupon the other two turned away. West of Krutayarka, other enemy tanks attempted to break out to the northeast. At the last moment, the advance was terminated by the guns of the 3rd Battalion of Panzer Artillery Regiment 128, especially those of the 7th Battery with its 10-centimeter cannon, which set up in the open in the face of the advancing Soviet armor. As it turned dusk, Kampfgruppe Salzmann moved out once again. Its objective was to throw the enemy south of Krutayarka back to Losovenka. The enemy resistance in the area of .154.1 was so strong, however, that no further advance was possible at the onset of night. The Kampfgruppe set up all-around defenses 1.5 kilometers southeast of Krutayarka, while the Engineer Battalion and the Anti-Tank Battalion screened in front of the village. On the right, Kampfgruppe Bachmann closed up to the engineers at the northern part of Mikhailovka, while the 2nd Battalion of Schutze Regiment 126 and the Motorcycle Battalion positioned themselves at +1.7 west of Losovenka. Soon after the onset of darkness, there was a crisis on the left wing of the division. The strong points established by the 2nd Battalion of Schutze Regiment 126 and Kradschutzen Battalion 23 became the focal point of a desperate breakout attempt on part of the Soviets. Dense masses of Soviet infantry, yelling their battle cry of "Ura!" assaulted the ridgeline west of Losovenka and the defile adjoining it to the west. Some of them had been fired up with alcohol and were without weapons. They were mown down in rows, but they kept on coming and were soon at the strong points, overrunning them or encircling them. 16 men of the motorcycle battalion were captured by the Soviets, disarmed, and then clubbed to death in the most brutal manner possible, with spades. The fury of their comrades, who discovered them the next day, was boundless. As the motorcycle infantry were increasingly pushed back from their positions, and they found themselves fighting their way clear to the north, more with entrenching tools than rifles, the men of the light SPW company, who had been separated from their vehicles, held their positions and set up an all-around defense of Hill 186 for the rest of the night. The only assistance that could be rendered to the hard-pressed battalions was an advance of the tanks from their defensive positions south of Krutayarka. They headed south and placed heavy fire against the Soviets advancing north, further to the east, but in the pitch-black night the enemy was difficult to make out. The defensive position of Kampfgruppe Salzmann was also subjected to attacks by Soviet forces, and 2 officers were wounded in their tanks. The main clearing station, manned by the 1st Medical Company in Nikolaevka, was overflowing with the sudden increase in casualties. Soviet forces pressed northward on both sides of Hill 186 in the sector of Hauptmann von Kunov's Kradschutzen Battalion 23. Around 0200 hours, they reached the outpost line of the division headquarters, 2 kilometers south of the 1st May collective farm. The outposts were successful in turning back the enemy. Other Soviet forces pressed against the frontage of the 16th Panzer Division, east of Chopenka and Losovenka. During the night, Soviet aircraft dropped numerous parachutes with rations and ammunition for the encircled forces. Most of them landed amongst the German forces, however. At first light on 27th May, elements of Kampfgruppe Salzmann re-established the situation west of Losovenka. 2 rifle companies from the 3rd Panzer Division, as well as military police and motorcycle infantry, conducted a deliberate clearing action in the area of the fighting of the previous night. In the process, more than 1,000 prisoners were taken. So really a fascinating account, and we actually see direct reference to the Kradschutzen Battalion that Fritz was a part of. Now, we know from his casualty record Fritz was killed by a headshot, and given the reference to a hill 1.8 kilometers west of Losovenka, and we know that the 2nd Battalion of Schutze Regiment 126 and the Kradschutzen Battalion were at a point 1.7 kilometers west of Losovenka, that this must have been the hill where Fritz and his unit dug in. And it was during this assault by Soviet infantry that were trying to escape this encirclement that Fritz would be shot in the head. And we, of course, see the grim reference that several men of the battalion were actually captured and beaten to death, but that does not seem to be the case for Fritz. So it seems like he was killed earlier in the fighting, and then 16 of his comrades were clubbed to death later after they'd been captured. Now, moving to the bottom of the card here. Dying, there is a hero of Wolfstop blood. His sight is broken. He could only see life for a short time. Once again, the bleaching lips open to a last farewell word. Live, my good parents, brothers, and acquaintances. That was a little rough there. And then the second paragraph. I have to go from this earth. Thanks be to you, dear ones. Good things for everything you did for me. God in heaven will reward you because I can no longer do it on earth. Hold to God, my dear ones. Comfort yourselves, because as a hero I fell for the fatherland. And we can see that this card is issued by the deeply mourning parents and brothers. And on the back of Fritz's card here, we see a photo of him in just a civilian suit. And then at the very bottom, until we meet again, our greatest hope. So overall, really interesting card. And of course, having the unit history for this one was great because I was having a heck of a time finding Losovenka. And then being able to pull out the maps in the book and see exactly where it was very helpful. And of course, really ties together the situation that was going on when Fritz was killed. And before we leave here, I do have two other cards for the 23rd Panzer Division. Josef Kulper, who was an Obergefreiter and Funktruppführer in the staff company of Schutze Regiment 126, was killed by a headshot at Peshchinoye, Ukraine on March 14th, 1942, just a few months before Fritz. And then Josef Burel, who was a Schutze and Panzer Grenadier Regiment 128, who died as a result of an amputation of his left thigh at Kashiri, Ukraine on November 28th, 1942. So yeah, overall, really interesting card. I hope you guys all enjoyed the video. Please leave a comment down below. Love hearing from you. Thank you all for watching. Happy collecting, and I'll see you all again very soon.